Morning, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging I'd like to start by recognizing that CBRD is on the unceded territories of the Kwetson, Malahat, Subaxat, Halalt, Penelakut, Semanis, Laxan, Pocatchin, Didadat, and Pacheedaht nations, whose people have walked here gently for thousands of years. And with the quorum being present, I'd like to call this meeting to order. Our first item of business is approval of the agenda. Would someone like to move that we approve the agenda as presented? Director Morrison? Apologies, everyone. I'm still trying to get the hang of this thing. Director Morrison.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to raise for the committee's understanding that the item R1 on this agenda is being considered by this committee, but as the chair of the Electoral Area Services Committee, it's with great chagrin that I will support the adoption of the agenda, but this item is a very electoral area specific agenda item, and it disturbs me that it is on this agenda. It should, I want to ensure that we do good process and good procedure, and it's unfortunate that the electoral area directors aren't considering this report first.
All right, would someone like to move that we adopt the agenda? Moved by Director Segal. Do I have a seconder? Seconded by Director Martman. All in favor? And opposed? None opposed. Motion carries. We'll now move on to the minutes. Director Morrison opposed? We'll now move on to the minutes, and there is a slight change to the minutes. I'm going to turn to the corporate officer.
Thank you, Chair. The Committee of Whole meeting minutes of February 12th, 2025 to be amended. R3 should read $30,300. Minor correction. Thank you.
Would someone like to move that we adopt the minutes from the Committee of the Whole meeting on February 12th as amended? Moved by Director Martman, seconded by Director Nicholson. Any discussion? All in favor? And opposed? Unopposed, motion carries. We'll now move on to public input period. So public input period is offer the public an opportunity to comment on an agenda item before the committee considers the item. The public input period procedure policy allows for an allotment of 15 minutes where the speaker is welcome to comment on any item on the agenda up to a maximum of 3 minutes. This excludes items that are or have been the subject of a public hearing. Input from the community is valued and appreciated. We request that input is presented in a friendly and respectful manner. Your cooperation in maintaining a safe and respectful and orderly environment is greatly appreciated. Great, sir, if you could state your name and address.
My name is David Slade. I live at 3265 Cobble Hill Road, Cobble Hill. I would like to speak to agenda item R2, Island Rail Corridor Shared Visioning. Thank you, honored chair, elected officials, and respected staff for allowing me this opportunity to speak. Special thanks to Allison and Coralie on the CVRD staff that led this process and have put you way ahead of all other jurisdictions. I agree with many points highlighted in the report. I agree that the restoration of rail is unaffordable in the short to medium term. I agree that restoring rail service in the short to medium term would be ineffective, unproductive, and expensive. I agree that unless the corridor is continuous from Victoria to Courtenay, it will never be viable for trains. Note that the Snana-Os First Nation in Nanoose has already removed 1 kilometer of rail where it bisects their reserve lands, and that in the 5 places in the CVRD where the rail corridor bisects reserved lands, some, if not all of the First Nations are likely to seek reversion of the land and similarly oppose the return of trains through their backyards. I agree that on 80% of the corridor, it is difficult or impractical to locate a trail beside the railbed. However, I feel that several conclusions drawn in the report are incorrect. I disagree that locating a trail on the railbed precludes a return of trains to the corridor. In fact, a trail on the railbed could act as a placeholder for the next 10 to 20 years, demonstrating the value of the corridor as a public good while acknowledging that rail traffic is the first priority for the corridor. This is the case with the Galloping Goose in Victoria. I disagree that the cost of remediation would be at least $1.75 million per kilometer. If the corridor retains its industrial status with a trail as a temporary use, there would likely be minimal to zero remediation requirements. The remediation costs for the recently completed Okanagan Rail Trail and the under construction North Okanagan Shuswap Rail Trail have been insignificant or non-existent. The report states that the most important needs for the Island Rail Corridor are, in this order, improved transportation connections, expand economic development and tourism, improve safe cycling and walking, provide emergency access routes, and provide recreation and park-like activities. A trail on the rail bed does all of these things. The report states that the corridor development should limit the removal of vegetation, avoid damage to riparian and aquatic ecosystems. A trail on the rail bed addresses this. Retaining the status quo guarantees that the creosote ties will continue to pollute, the steel rails will continue to rust, and the corridor will remain a liability rather than an amazing asset. If we build a trail on the rail bed, it will be used by many hundreds of people in this valley every single day and improve the quality of life across the entire CVRD. With 5 seconds to spare. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other members of the public like to come up to the podium? So you could state your name and address.
My name is Alan Phillip. I live at 5734 Vancoy Road in North Cowichan. And I'd like to address the issue of the vision for the Island Corridor. Good morning, councillors. Thank you for this opportunity. I have read the report and it's very comprehensive. However, in my view, there are two major flaws in this report. One of them near the beginning is the statement that 79% of the respondents want to see rail on the corridor in the future, as opposed to 49% for trail. Now, this to me is a very simplistic question and response because it pits trail against rail, and this is not a popularity contest. This is a matter of practicality. The trail, in my view, could be seen as an interim measure for possibility in the future of there being a train. Now, both levels of government do not intend to contribute any money towards a train in the foreseeable future. That's why the Snonagh has got their land back. Any return of train is way, way in the future when there's sufficient population density and a business case supporting a modern train on those tracks, which would attract sufficient ridership to actually pay for it. In my view, that's going to be way past any of our lifetimes. So the question to me is not rail or trail, it's what do we do in the interim while we're waiting? Right now, the whole system is just lying there deteriorating. It makes far more sense to me to use that corridor as a trail, which would benefit both recreationalists, commuters, particularly people with e-bikes who are a very rising population, particularly old people like me. I'm back riding a bike again on an e-bike, and I see it done everywhere now. And just imagine being able to ride your e-bike from Duncan up to Ladysmith, off any of the roads, a really good commuter trail, and the same thing down to Cobble Hill. You're off the highway. There's no safe way to get to Cobble Hill right now on a bicycle. The other point which I would like to say is a really major flaw is saying that having a trail precludes the return of rail. That is absurd. Just have a look at Cowichan Valley Trail out to Lake Cowichan. That would very easily be able to put a train back on that. Just imagine how difficult would that be? It would be very
Mr.
easy
Phil,
to do.
we're at time.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome. You could state your name and address.
Yeah, hi. I'm Warren Sculward. I live at 2299 McFarland Crescent. A lot of people would probably know me as Restore Island Rail. I've been advocating, thank you. I've been advocating for the railway for about 2.5 years now. My material online has had millions of views. This is not just a small number. The island-wide, when you're talking about the possibility or the want and need of rail on Vancouver Island, that 79% is actually quite low from what I've seen. Usually it's up around 83%. The radio stations that have done polls have shown upward, 75%. So it's been a consistent want and need of the public. The public has spoken. They say they want rail on the corridor. Now, I know funding is an issue. You've got you got this Island Rail Corporation going out there trying to collect up money, trying to get the rails back in operation. You got the First Nations that are having questions about, how can they benefit from the rail? Well, if the rail is removed and we put the trail on, and despite what David is saying, trying to get a trail turned back into rail is next to impossible. The cycling movement will just come up and they'll just go nuts and you'll never get it back. And if that was different, if that was not the case, then Souk right now would be looking at the Galloping Goose piece that goes from Souk to the 6 Mile where the new BRT lanes are going to be going. We'd be turning that back into rail because it would be a dedicated corridor for trains, which, transit, trains, buses. A train is just an elongated bus, okay? And it's a lot smoother, a lot more comfortable. They have accessible bathrooms. It's a much preferred option. Trails can be put beside it. There's 65 kilometers already of trails beside the rails. And like in Shawnigan, where the new Shawnigan Rail Trail is, it actually can veer away and utilize other trails on the island to connect all the way up and down the island. It doesn't have to stay next to the rails all the time. Cyclists have told me that riding on a rail trail is actually quite boring after some time because it's just straight, and they like curves and hills and things like that to give it more variety. So I really hope that everybody will consider and try to retain the rails where we can, and hope to God that we can convince the First Nations that they can benefit from this rail too. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. See your name and address.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kim Bernard. I live in the Shawnigan Beach Estates in Shawelican, Shawnigan Lake, Area B of the CVRD. I would like to speak to R1, which is the South Cowichan Community Assessment Report. I want to offer gratitude and congratulations to everyone, including all of the input that was received. This is an incredible report. My remarks today, if you can bear with me, we'll drill down on pages 8 and 9 of the report. I'd like to first respectfully offer a correction to the origin story and name that is listed in the report for my area of Shawnigan Lake. I have with me a documented interview with Jared Christinachan Williams, who sat down with the Discourse in October of 2020 to explain the meaning and name behind Shawelican, that it means something mysterious happened here that we do not understand, and it's a wonderful story in the Discourse. So I would like that information to go to the EcoPlan Committee. And next up, I would just like to say that this report identifies a pattern and alludes to a growth pattern. So I know we're all worried about the A word here in Canada, but I would like to offer the word amalgamation is also hanging over our heads in the South End because of the growth projections in the Capital Regional District. And if we wonder who the gatekeepers are for any change of governance, we have to look no further than the province of British Columbia. And I think they have already told us what they think of the future projection, because they have redrawn the electoral boundary, and I brought that with me too, to include all of South Cowichan, together with Souk as the Juan de Fuca electoral area district. And that, along with their amazing stewardship of our natural water resources, instead of following the money, I follow the water, tells me that they have more than enough capacity to look after the south end should they choose to look at this wonderful home inspection report and decide to make a bid to acquire us in the next 10 to 20 years. And so I would invite this board to also include that in your planning, that some of us would like to remain rural or certainly have the quality of life that we currently enjoy. And this report belongs to all the people in our community. So my last, ask would be that this board works closely with the 3 area directors to make sure this information is published in a way that most people who can't navigate the website can read. So I did bring the last exhibit, which is the Shawnigan Focus, as an example of community reporting. And they too refer to our region as Shawelican. So I really do hope to have that corrected in the report. And thank you, everyone. Haichka.
Okay, thank
5
you.
seconds to spare.
Okay, I think we've got time for at least one more speaker. Nobody else? So if you could state your name and address.
Yes, my name is Dick Folks. I live in View Royal, 196 Wera Road. I drove up here this morning to come to this meeting because I find it very encouraging that this regional district is working on this subject. And I'd like to think that it's going to be all positive. I've been working on trying to promote rail, or the maintenance, or the restoration of Island Rail for ever since I retired about almost 40 years ago. I've spent many hours making presentations, trying to show the benefits of it, so that people would learn, but it seems to be a big struggle. Wherever I see the word "it's expensive," I think that should be challenged. Expensive is not a word that should be in the vocabulary of any report. There should be a figure, and a comparative figure. Compared to what is it expensive? Coming out here from Helmkin Road, as usual, the Trans-Canada Highway is almost a walking speed, all the way from Veterans Parkway to Helmkin. They're just piling up, and it's just every day, every day. The rail could handle a lot of that traffic. Coming up here, I note that the people going to and from Duncan could easily, many of them, I'm sure, go by rail and take their bike. Yes, certainly. But they're not going to pedal all that way. The Trans-Canada Highway is quickly becoming much like a city street with all the frequent lights. A friend and I handed out pamphlets at Naden, which is a major employment area in Esquimalt, promoting rail at the time when the employees were coming off work. And some of them literally snatched the pamphlets out of my hand, saying, "I live in Ladysmith," or such. "This vehicle would bring me right to the door of my employment." The crawl through View Royal is absolutely horrendous. I worked at the dockyard in my lifetime, and it was always a crawl, and it's not any better. For cyclists who object to rail, all I can say is, yeah, maybe at my age I might like to ride a bicycle in the Cowichan area. But do you think I'm going to ride a bicycle all the way from View Royal to Cowichan? But on the other hand, I could jump on a rail car with my bike and come up here and enjoy this valley.
Oh,
Thank
sir,
you.
We're at time. Thank you. So that concludes public input. We can now move on straight to reports. The first report in front of us is with regards to the South Cowichan Community Issues Assessment. So we do have a presentation from Ecoplan, and I understand we have a representative from Ecoplan who's going to deliver this presentation. Oh, and Ms. Ferguson's going to first provide an overview.
Good morning, Chair and Directors. I am here along with our consultant this morning to present the South Cowichan Community Issues Assessment Report. This report provides the residents' perspectives on governance and service delivery challenges within the South Cowichan region. The data and its findings presented in the report were compiled utilizing a wide variety of inputs, such as the online survey, community forums, pop-up events, meetings with local stakeholders, and consultations with CVRD staff. This project stems from a board directive and was subsequently captured in your strategic plan as Objective 2.3. I am proud to introduce our consultant, Anne-Marie Whitaker, who is an Associate Senior Planner with EcoPlan. Anne-Marie will provide you with a PowerPoint presentation, and then we will welcome your comments, questions following that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for allowing me to come back and present the outcome and the findings from this report. So appreciate that. Just checking in if technically speaking, everyone can see the actual PowerPoint presentation, not presenter view.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much. And I also just want to pause for a moment to say thank you to the public speaker this morning for comments on the assessment, and then also sharing some information for updating the report. So I appreciate that a lot. What I'll do quickly, just to give you a quick outline of the presentation in terms of what I'll talk about today. I'll give you a quick project overview for some of you who may not be as familiar with the project as the electoral area Bay A, B, and C. We'll talk a bit about what we heard and then considerations for next steps moving forward. To begin, I'll talk a little bit about the project overall, but generally speaking, wanted to focus your attention on the area of this report and where the focus happens. It was for residents living in South Cowichan communities, electoral areas A, B, and C. The purpose of the report, or the project or study in general, was to help residents and the CVRD understand the current governance and servicing situation for these electoral areas. And I say CVRD as well because it's just getting a picture of how residents feel about governance and servicing. It was also to engage residents and collect their issues and concerns, so it was really targeted about that, related to governance and servicing overall, and then report out on what we heard from residents in the hopes that we would identify any service or governing gaps that may exist. One thing I did want to point out before this, and this is something we had to remind residents quite frequently of throughout this work as well, was that this was not an incorporation study. This was, as mentioned, this work was to identify and acknowledge the concerns, and then to really clarify any of the problems before jumping to solutions. Just to take this information as a way to first explore those options for addressing concerns within existing framework or governance framework. This being a very important step for the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, just to identify the problems first. Is the ladder on the right wall? It was just looking at that first step. And so there was 4 phases to this project moving it forward, which occurred over the 2024 period. Mainly during spring and summer and a little bit into the fall. So a lot of this engagement occurred over a period, just noting that that typically isn't an engagement period, but we did get out there. So it included the background work, a situation assessment, engagement to identify those issues, and then drafting the final report. So now I'll move in and just give you the highlights of the overall what we heard in terms of the assessment. Just before I get into the outcomes of it, to give you just an overview of the outreach and engagement that was included within the process of the reporting, we did use the CVRD Plan Your Cowichan webpage for information. We also had information and rack cards that were delivered throughout the communities. There was social media posts to advertise both the survey and some of the events that were happening throughout the spring and summer. We had community posters, lawn signs throughout the community, an ad placed in the Focus magazine. Community survey was running throughout that whole period of time. We had one community forum in each community or electoral area, pop-up events that happened throughout the summer, and then we did do some reaching out to neighboring First Nations communities, community groups, and targeted interviews with CVRD staff and improvement districts. Engagement overall, we compiled 412 survey responses. There was 96 residents who attended the community forums held in each electoral area. Many residents were engaged at pop-up events. Those were actually really great to get out to because we were going to people in various locations throughout electoral area A, B, and C. We sent an invitation to 9 community groups for input or allowing input, or requesting it rather. And then 9 targeted interviews with CVRD staff, departments, and then an invitation to continued engagement with First Nations communities. We had 1 information meeting that was held, and then project updates were provided for that as well. So the following is what we heard. This is both a mix through the community forum input and the surveys outputs. So for the purpose of the report, this information was grouped into 3 main themes: governance, servicing, and then those areas or issues and concerns that residents raised that were outside the jurisdiction of CVRD. So we needed sort of a container for those as well. And so to give you some of the highlights for both the survey and community forums, 68% of residents felt that they understood what a regional district is and how it operates. 55% of residents felt that they understood how decisions and voting happens at the CVRD, and noting that our survey actually had a bit of that kind of before asking questions, kind of explaining how that happens as well. So there was a bit of an education piece within that survey too, for those who may not have felt they understood initially. And then residents ranked the following issues as most important to them within these areas. And so this is compiled of those areas: accountability, responsiveness to local concerns, and transparency and governance. Just breaking this down a bit by electoral area to get a bit of information of where they differed, Area A was most concerned with communication, transparency, and accountability, whereas B and C shared a stronger interest in representation of and response to their area's local concerns and issues. So their interests more so than the communication transparency. So just a little bit of the differences there. Voting structure and the ability of other area directors to vote or influence decisions affecting the electoral areas A, B, and C were also very common comments that we received both through the community forum as well as on the survey. And many comments received at the community forums focused on concerns and issues that, as mentioned, were outside the jurisdiction of the CVRD. And so just to give you a sense of what those were expressed by residents that fell into that category are listed here. And they're generally, I guess, listed in the order of frequency that we heard them, but that's not statistically counted, but it is just in general, just how we compiled these. So some of the biggest ones were about the road standards and maintenance, so local traffic, pedestrian and active transportation, potholes and snow removal, coordination of improvement districts and private utilities, as well as equity of services between different areas, and then just a concern for aging infrastructure, water quality and watershed protection, and I'll note that this was more so in Area B, and then proposed subdivision development application wait times and frequency of transit service or inefficiency of routes was mentioned. In terms of servicing, 76% of residents felt they understood service delivery in CVRD, 23% of residents were satisfied with services received, and 28% had a neutral stance. Noting that many comments that were received on servicing at this time and during this period were related to the change in the garbage collection, as well as TOPS concerns for servicing, and these were compiled with all of them. New growth and development was a top concern, as well as cost for services, especially in areas who would also pay additional user fees and their taxes. And then efficiency and coordination between jurisdictions, as well as inequity of service provision. Additionally, 57% of residents felt they understood how service costs were determined, and residents' concerns with cost of services were that costs were too high, that paying for services they don't receive or most often benefit from, or felt that they didn't benefit from, and a concern for how costs are calculated. and feeling that they're paying more than their fair share for those services. So those were some of the overview of resident concerns and issues with respect to for servicing. So looking at just a high-level summary of all of this combined together, so just taking a step back and then looking at the survey and the community forums, just noting that issues, many of these were all very much interrelated. Just noting that many of the issues were identified by residents, but they were also identified in our interviews with CVRD and area directors. So basically everyone's saying the same thing. They're all, there's not a huge gaps in there. And although there were many questions about why this wasn't an incorporation study and why this wasn't about that topic in particular, just noting that independence and autonomy, when it was listed within the survey as well as at community forums, wasn't ranked as a top issue at most of those within the work that we came back or the input that we received. And then just noting that the top of what we called cross-cutting issues, so those issues that were identified residents, CVRD, and other service providers, were all mostly focused or related to the level of service and servicing, followed by those aspects that I mentioned that were outside the CVRD's jurisdiction. And then cross-cutting issues by theme in terms of governance, accessible information and communications on servicing and responsibilities was noted. Jurisdiction was just the subdivision development times, coordination, planning objectives and policy, and then servicing infrastructure and growth being huge, continued upgrades and replacements, so worrying about that future, how it will look, inequity between areas, maintenance, regional planning, and then water supply and protection. So just noting that there was that study that was done back in 2009, and then kind of looking at today and comparing those two, basically not much has changed since 2009. There has been a few shifting concerns, taxes and user fees and rising cost of living kind of came to the top a little bit more, and then coordination and communication between jurisdictions for regional and strategic planning on infrastructure was also something that came up more frequently than what it looked like in 2009. So to wrap up, I just wanted to talk a little bit about next steps. This report offers some considerations for next steps and what to do with the information. And this was grouped again into the three themes of governance, servicing, and those outside the jurisdiction of CVRD, noting again that many of these overlap and are interrelated. So in terms of considerations for governance, possibly looking at coordinating infrastructure on a more regional basis, targeting a review and update of CVRD planning and policy with these issues that have come up through this. So that could just look like an actual review, or it could be just when policy and plans are being updated, that you use these issues or this output to sort of target certain areas. Increase information to residents on governance and servicing, and then conducting a follow-up governance study, possibly to explore changes within the regional district model that would address some of these concerns that came out through this assessment. And this could explore changes, could also be incorporated, or some of this work could be incorporating at a regional level into future regional planning work as well. In terms of considerations for servicing, maybe looking at highlighting the board priorities related to servicing specifically for South Cowichan residents. So this is a bit of a communications thing. Explore changes to budgets to focus on South Cowichan communities, in particular on some of the issues that were raised. Look at ways to increase collaboration between CVRD, municipalities, and improvement districts, exploring the potential to reduce improvement districts and amalgamate some of the services to better address some of the issues that came forward. And then in terms of jurisdiction, increasing advocacy and communications with MOT, it's now Transportation and Transit. And this is ongoing, I know, but also so looking at ways to increase that or to address some of the issues that have come forth. Engaging and lobbying senior levels of government, also ongoing, I'm sure. And then looking for ways to improve coordination of subdivision approval process. And if not, maybe exploring options under the Land Title Act, which I know has also been something ongoing too. And then Possible next steps, just to finish up. So looking at the considerations that were just listed and maybe prioritizing these in issues. So is communications to residents a top priority, or is maybe looking at changes to servicing or plans and policies? Just determining that, mapping out departments that are involved and the plans and policies that, or maybe additional studies that might be required. Evaluating options and key actions, and then of course knowing which ones things that you're targeting to identify budget allocation and external funding or whatever is needed to support some of these changes, and then reporting back, of course, as the most important, and updating the South Cowichan community residents with any changes or movements or directions that are taken by the board. And with that, just covers it at a very high level at a high speed. There you go.
Great, thank you for the presentation. I'll turn to the committee, ask if there's any questions, but I will note that staff have prepared a suggested motion here that speaks to the concern raised by Director Morrison about having this referred to the Electoral Area Services Committee for further discussion. So we can either consider this motion, or if anyone's got any questions for the presenter. Director Acton and then Director McClinton.
Clarity, is that the motion I shared with the board? Oh, okay.
Okay, so I said staff motion, your motion.
Well, it is staff.
Yeah, all right. Any discussion, or do we want to?
For the presenter?
Any questions for the presenter? Director Abbott?
Perhaps a two-prong, and it may be more for staff to answer. Can you refresh our memories as to how long this process has taken to get to this, to today's report, and ballpark, how much have we spent getting to this report?
Yeah, so the work was as a result of a grant from the province. The grant was $60,000. So we have spent pretty much that. It has taken a year. It started January last year. So there was a lot of consultation with the communities and outreach and to get to this point. So.
Any further discussion? Are we ready to consider this recommendation? Director McClinton.
Am I on? Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I was a couple moments late. Could you read the motion for me? Is that possible?
Yeah, I don't think I've actually read it out for anyone yet. So it's that it be recommended to the board that staff report back to the Electoral Area Services Committee with a report that provides further information and options to address South Cowichan community issues. South Cowichan community identified issues in the categories of governance, servicing, and jurisdiction as proposed in the Equal Plan report. Director Wilson.
Oh, I was just moving.
Okay, so it's moved. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Director Segal. Any further discussion? Director Acton?
Yeah, I'd just like to understand how come this wasn't at Electoral Area Services Committee to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the answer to that. Ms. Miles Wilson?
Sorry, I don't see it. I'll just, oh, there we go. Jesse's on camera. Thanks for the question. So a couple of things. So originally the direction came through the board, right? And it's in your strategic plan as well. So recognizing the comments that have already been shared about the need to have an electoral area discussion, staff hear you loud and clear. Some of the recommendations and considerations in this report do require the board's support to proceed. And so staff's recommendation was to put this on this committee of the whole so that everybody could benefit from the presentation and receive the information. But we recognize that the further deep dive into this will definitely have to be at Electoral Area Services Committee.
Any further discussion? We ready to call the question? Director Justice.
Yeah, thank you. Recognizing that it's going to the EAC probably, I'll just take the opportunity to ask one question of the presenter, if that's all right. And it's sort of what I consider to be a bit of a contradiction with respect to the ranking of issues specific to governance. noted that the statement that independence and autonomy consistently ranked as the lowest concern related to governance in all of the survey responses. And I just wondered how that might square with the idea that there was a lot of concern that other electoral area directors had too much say in issues that are specific to A, B, and C. So those two things seem to me to be contradictory, and I just wondered if you could take a stab at making that consistent for me.
Ms. Whitaker?
Yes, thank you. No, it's true. That's why I mentioned many times that many of these are interrelated, and so sometimes they overlap, and it's difficult to pull apart. But just, I was noting that, I guess we, kind of overall, there was a lot of talk of whether or not that this, this study or assessment was whether it was about incorporation, and so we had to separate that out. But in the survey, we just asked if independence and autonomy is the a top concern, and it just didn't ever get ranked as one of the top concerns. But of course, as you mentioned, there's a number of other, talking about communication or the voting or whatnot, that overlaps with independence and autonomy. So you're correct, like that it is a bit of a contradiction. It's just that in noting that in the survey, that was constantly be put as your top concern for residents, that residents were more often concerned with, communication or just the servicing or service-related issues that have come about, or just into the details of roads or things that were more, close to home hitting. So yeah, no, thank you for pointing that out. Those things are overlapping, and they do, if you're concerned with voting, then obviously you're concerned with an autonomy or a level of autonomy. But consistently, when residents ranked their top issues, it was more about response of the board or response of the CVRD to the issues that matter to them the most, as opposed to, jumping to the, we want independence from everyone else.
Thank you.
Does that help kind of explain how that came about?
Yeah, I mean, it remains quite interesting to me, but yeah.
It was to me too, yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
All right, before we call the question, just one thought for the Electoral Area Services Committee to consider, and also the rest of the board. We did get the attachment to the report subsequently after the agenda was published with some of the breakdown of the growth projections. What we found at the municipality of North Cowichan is that there is quite a bit of uncertainty and I'd say contradictions around some of the growth projections. So we've been given, like many other municipalities, a housing target order with a particular figure that we have to reach over a 5-year period. We've been advised that that's 75% of our housing need, so two different numbers. We've also done an updated housing needs report based on a formula from the province, which has given us a third number. And then we've also reviewed the BC Stats population and household projections, which has given us a fourth number over the next 5, 10, 20 years. So we've written to the housing minister asking for clarification on this, because we're working with very different figures, and they're not within a small range. There's quite a range between these 4 different figures. Complicating this is the federal government has announced some pretty drastic changes with regards to federal immigration policies. So as you know, in Canada, we've got a declining natural birth rate. Our population growth has been driven by record immigration numbers in recent years, which were pushing growth rates 2.5%, 3% in 2022, 2023, 1.9% last year. With the federal government recently announcing a pretty drastic reversal of the federal immigration policies, we're now looking at a population decline in Canada for this year of 0.2%, another decline of 0.2% the following year, and then 0.8% growth the year after that. And what we've been advised by the housing minister is that government is reviewing and revising their population household projections based on these new immigration numbers. So I just point that out in that we do all this analysis on growth projections, housing needs, yet we're confronted with all these very contradictory numbers, and then we find out all those contradictory numbers aren't correct because the federal government has made these big changes, again, with federal immigration policy, and we're going to have to revise those projections. I think we can all be confident that we live in quite a beautiful part of the world, beautiful part of the country. There's going to be people wanting to come here. There's going to be growth, but I would just encourage everyone, whether it's through this exercise or any of the work we're doing, to be a bit skeptical on some of these numbers that have been presented to us, because they are subject to pretty drastic change when there's a slight change in policy at the federal or provincial level. So I've got Director Morrison and then Director Wilson here. Director Morrison.
Thank you, Chair. And just in regards to Director Justice's remarks, it's an interesting contradiction, and one of the things that our friends and residents in the South Cowichan have always noted, and all the time that I've been here, is that curiosity about how this federation works and why the different municipal and electoral area directors that may be far flung from that region participate and vote on issues that are of a concern. And so that's one of the reasons why we make sure that we all know what's going on in our communities, and that we are wise to go and attend some of the community events and engagements that happen in the southern part of our region, because folks like to know that if you're going to be participating in voting on issues that concern South Cowichan, that you're there and present and understand what the issues are related to that area. So that's pretty important. But my question for our presenter today is, and I read with interest about it seemed like there's a relatively high level of understanding about not only the voting, but the fiscal aspect of how our regional district works, and that there seemed to be a fairly high level of understanding amongst residents as to who pays for what, and you have to benefit from a service or be as part of a service, paying for it and receiving benefit. And I note that you did differentiate that there's a difference between the municipal structure of how taxes are collected and then distributed versus in an electoral area or in the regional district. Did you drill down a little bit on that? Just because I find when people move to my community, electoral area F, from a municipality, and then I take the time to describe a little bit how each individual function collects taxes for that function and for that service, and only those people that are in that service are paying for and receiving benefits. Did you drill down a little bit on that with people as you were collecting this information?
Ms. Whitaker?
Thank you. In terms of just at community forums, when people would have conversations, we would talk a little bit more about that. But no, it wasn't something. I mean, aside from, as I mentioned, within the survey, there would be each question, preceding each question was a little bit of information about how the regional district operated. So so there was that, and then as I mentioned, staff was in attendance at community forums as well, and so staff was there to provide additional information and drill a little bit more deeper into how that operates. Yeah.
Follow up, Director Morrison? I've got Director Wilson, then Director Dack.
Thank you, Chair. This is more a question for what you've just mentioned. You touched on migration as opposed to immigration. Are there any numbers that anybody's come up with a possible forecast on that? Because that's a major part of what's happening here on our island, migration rather than immigration. Do we have any numbers for that kind of thing? Or maybe the consultant knows that one as well.
Yeah, I'll turn to Ms. Whitaker in a moment. I mean, we have our own housing needs projections, as you know, here at the regional district municipalities as well. The one challenge is those are based on assumptions made at the provincial level and federal level, so they are informed by those immigration numbers.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Whitaker, anything to add to that?
No, the numbers that were used for the QPDD assessment was based on the recent 2024 housing needs assessment. So that's the source of the population data that was used.
So I've got Director Deck, then Director McClinton.
Thank you very much for that huge, wonderful report. I certainly saw the overlaps with Area I, and I'm grateful that this is going to go on to the EASC, because at that point maybe there'll be some resolutions that will satisfy South Cowichan as well. I think we would all benefit from more transparency, and there's at least a perception of lack of services. So yes, I'm grateful for that, for your report, and for us moving it all forward. Thank you.
Director McClinton.
Thank you, Chair. While I respect all of my colleagues' opinions deeply, greatly, I am, I don't know what the right word is. I'm not sure how or why it ended up at Committee of the Whole, this information item. So I would like to call to question the motion on the floor.
All right, I see no other speakers with their hands raised. I'll call the question. All in favor? And opposed? None opposed, motion carries. We can now move on to our next report. Thanks, Ms. Whitaker, for the presentation.
Thank you.
We'll move on to our next report, the CVRD Island Rail Corridor Shared Visioning Project, final report. Turn to staff to provide an overview.
Good morning, Chair and Directors. I'm pleased to introduce today Salih Tarani and Johan van Schek from Stantec, who led the report that will be presented today, and Lindsay Fryatt-Yurke from Modus, who led the communications. And over to them now. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's well. Just going to start sharing the screen here. I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Thank you very much. I hope you're well, and I really appreciate the time to present the report today. My name is Saleh. I'm a senior rail engineer and project manager for the Stantec. And today, in collaboration with my colleagues, Lindsay and Johan, we're going to provide a summary presentation on the Island Rail Corridor towards a Shared Vision project report. Going to the next slide, here's our agenda. On the first few slides, I'm going to go over to the introduction and rail history slides. There's going to be a brief conversation there on the project, and then I'm going to hand it over to Lindsay to go over the findings on the First Nation engagement and public and stakeholder engagement. Then we have our technical scope of the project, and Johan is going to provide a summary on the environmental scope, land use planning, transportation planning, options and option assessment. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to quickly go over the next steps identified at the end of our project. And while we have booked time at the end of the presentation to answer the questions, because of the multidisciplinary nature of the project, if you guys have any question during the presentation, please feel free to share that with us, and we'll be more than happy to answer that either during the presentation or at the end of the presentation. Going over the next slide, here's our project structure. So towards a shared region project was initiated and funded by Ministry of Transportation in collaboration with 5 regional districts, including CVRD, 14 First Nations, and Island Corridor Foundation. We started the project in April last year. We completed our draft report late 2024 and finalized that in January 2025. And one of the important aspects of the project scope was history of the Island Rail Corridor, and we reviewed the Island Rail Corridor history, and we summarized that, presented that in the report. In addition, in the past 20 years, there have been several technical reports and studies. We made sure to review them, summarize them, and provide a review of those findings, including track alignment, track condition reports dating back to 2003 all the way to 2020, freight analysis studies, business case study in 2022. In addition, we synthesized this recent work completed by ICF and Ministry of Transportation, such as Corridor Evaluation Report, Development Strategies for Rail Corridor Report, South Island Transportation Strategy, and Stakeholder Engagement completed in 2022. Now I'm going to pass it to my colleague Lindsay on the engagement scope.
Thank you, Saleh. I'm going to start with an overview of the First Nations engagement. First Nations engagement is critical to this project and understanding of the potential for a shared vision for the Island Rail Corridor as a whole. We're working within the colonial history of the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway land grants and the unresolved legal actions of a number of First Nations relating to reserve lands. In addition to that, First Nations were also undertaking their own visioning processes. So we wanted to understand the outcomes of those and coordinate across. So with this, our objectives for engagement were to collaborate and build relationships, to learn about each nation's involvement in visioning and any outcomes that they could share, to learn about each nation's interests in the different potential future uses, and specifically to learn from Cowichan tribes, Halalt and Stuminas First Nation about their desired future use for the bisected reserve lands. So with this, we engaged 7 nations through this process. In addition to Cowichan, Halalt, and Stuminas with their bisected reserve lands, we engaged with Malahat and Penelakut tribe, current members of ICF, and Subasset First Nation, a former member of ICF. And we also engaged with nations with traditional territory throughout the CVRD. Saleh, next slide. So I'll just go through nation by nation to share what we've heard. Cowichan tribes has reserve number 1 is bisected in 2 locations, 750 meters in the northern portion and 750 meters in the southern portion. The feedback that we received from Cowichan tribes is that they would like to have their bisected reserve lands returned to reserve. Just a bit of more context about that. Cowichan tribes followed the legal actions of Snow First Nations in 2015 that were brought against Canada and the Island Corridor Foundation. So they have legal actions that are not yet resolved that were issued in 2016. And they do not want a rail or trail to go through their reserve. Next slide. Halalt First Nation, reserve number 2, is bisected, you can see in the southern part of that image, by approximately 1,500 meters. Similar to Cowichan tribes, Halalt First Nation has filed legal actions against Canada and the Island Corridor Foundation in 2016, seeking the reversion of their former reserve lands. In terms of the feedback that we received from Halalt, they shared that land back is a priority. They're interested in understanding the options of different potential future uses and the cost implications. And they're interested also in the potential for the Island Rail Corridor in reducing the number of trucks on the highway that pass through reserve to help reduce the environmental and health impacts of those vehicles. So they recognize that if a rail was to be reintroduced, safety would need to be addressed, particularly as it passes through the reserve and splits cultural sites with homes on the other side of the rail. Next slide, please. Malahat First Nation does not have any bisected reserve lands. They do have a reserve that is located near the Island Rail Corridor. The feedback that we received is that regarding a preferred future use, they support the rights of First Nations with bisected reserve lands, and they don't have a preferred future use at this time that they can share with us. They are working to establish a guardian program with the intent of reestablishing a connection to their land. Their connection has been cut off since the corridor was established, and as many of you know, the corridor is difficult to access today. So they're creating a virtual reality toolkit with the intent of allowing community members and elders to virtually experience what is there today. They're also undertaking ecosystem assessment and natural asset inventory, and they're seeing if there's interest in a multimodal corridor. Of note about their feedback is that when the Malahat Highway is closed, they are highly impacted by this. It causes additional traffic to go through reserve, and they are concerned about emergency access and wildfire risk. So there may be a role for the Island Rail Corridor in supporting those concerns. Next slide, please. Penelakut Tribe does not have a bisected reserve. Their reserve is located approximately half a kilometer to the east of the Island Rail Corridor. Their meeting minutes were under review to confirm reporting permissions at the time of the report publishing. Next slide, please. Stewaminas First Nation has 2 reserves that are bisected by the Island Rail Corridor. Reserve number 11, seen at the top of the image, is bisected by about 550 meters, and reserve number 12 is bisected by about 1,200 meters. Stewaminas shared that they need more time to go back to their community to get a feel for what chief and council would like to see before they can share about a preferred future use. And our comments and questions were shared so that they can go and take these to community. Next slide, please. Siouxwasset First Nation is located on the north shore of Cowichan Lake. The reserve is not bisected by the Island Rail Corridor, but it is located near the spur line, which extends west to Cowichan Lake. So this is their greatest interest in the Island Rail Corridor. They shared that they see this as a significant opportunity for infrastructure pieces to extend out towards reserve, and that if planned properly, the Island Rail Corridor can create great transportation, tourism, and industrial opportunities to alleviate some of the challenges on the island. They emphasize that it's critical to understand and appreciate the complexity of the lands and how it affects each nation differently, and how each nation will have to be consulted with individually. Next slide, please. Our recommendation to the province was that they continue to provide ongoing funding to maintain the momentum that is underway and the collaboration that has been established through this phase of work. Next slide, please. So I just have a few slides here now on the public and stakeholder engagement. Thanks, Sally. Just as a high-level overview, we hosted a public open house on September 14th in Duncan. The open house included a video where you could actually experience and ride the rail, virtually, of course, and a story map which scrolled through GIS mapping so folks could better understand the context. There were about 350 people who attended. There was also an online survey to gather feedback. So through the survey, the public was invited to share about their potential future uses and preferred what they would like to see in the future. The survey was available through the month of September, and we received over 4,000 responses. There's incredible interest in this project. Next slide, thank you. In terms of some of the key takeaways from that survey, participants shared that transportation modes that best match their future vision for the Island Rail Corridor is a top choice. Folks could choose all that apply. 79% of people chose passenger rail. 49% of people chose biking and hiking trails. 42% chose freight. The table below just provides a bit of a breakdown between the CVRD and folks who responded from outside of the CVRD or didn't share where they were responding from. So inside the CVRD, you'll see that slightly fewer people are choosing rail as a preferred future use at 74% compared to people outside of the CVRD, which is 88%. In terms of biking and hiking trails, people inside the CVRD chose that slightly more at 52% versus outside of the CVRD at 47%. And freight service was more highly selected for people who are outside of the CVRD at 48% versus 38% inside the CVRD. Next slide, please. We also asked participants to share their priorities around potential additional uses that could be hosted within the corridor adjacent to a rail. We asked them to respond based on area, station area, so Chemainus, Cobble Hill, Cowichan, Duncan, Ladysmith, Malahat, and Shawnigan. Across all areas except Malahat, you can see there was consistency highlighted in green. Active transportation was the top choice, followed by tourism and then recreation and park-like activities. In the Malahat area, emergency preparedness was chosen more often than recreation and park-like activities. Next slide, please. In addition to public engagement, we hosted 19 one-on-one interviews with key stakeholders and organizations with interests in transportation, economic development, agriculture, environment, and utilities. Through these interviews, we heard that 7 out of 19 have a preferred future use of rail, 4 out of 19 have a preferred future use of rail and trail together, and 3 out of 19 had a preference for trail only. 5 out of 19 shared that they had no preferred future use. There were also some shared takeaways: upholding the rights of First Nations, maintaining the corridor as continuous in recognition that as a continuous corridor, that would preserve its potential for a future transportation use, and finding ways to improve island connectivity through the future of the corridor. Next slide, please. And you can move to the next one. Thank you. So finally, this slide is just to share some of the other process aspects that we undertook as a part of our collaboration across governments and with the Island Corridor Foundation. There was a regional district staff working group where staff met together to share process updates, outcomes, and draft directions. So that supported information sharing at the staff level across regional districts. There was the CVRD working group, which included regional and municipal staff. We shared process updates, technical deliverables, and got guidance and feedback on the work as it evolved. And then the CVRD also participated in meetings with the Island Corridor Foundation, again, to talk about process and share draft outcomes of the process. That's everything from me. Thank you, Sally. Oh, you're on mute.
Apologies. Thanks very much, Lindsay. Now we're going to go over the technical slides. Johan is going to go over them, and it's going to take around 15 to 20 minutes. Thanks very much. Apologies, Johan. You're muted as well. Sorry, still muted.
Is that any better?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, directors, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for the opportunity to just very briefly provide an overview of all the work that was undertaken. Specifically, in addition to the engagement and consultation tasks that we heard about earlier, considerable technical efforts were also undertaken, and these relate to environmental considerations, then the land use and transportation evaluation and assessment, and then based on the transportation options that were identified, an option assessment of these were undertaken as well. Next slide, please, Saleh. So next one, please. So if we go to environmental considerations, there are three components. Firstly, natural habitat. Natural habitat really reviewed background information to identify potential environmental constraints on development based on the natural features of the area. And the area was defined as the 30-meter wide corridor, and then included a 1 kilometer buffer on either side of the rail alignment. So therefore, identify habitats, plant and animal species were identified that could potentially be impacted by development along the corridor. Next slide, please. As far as remediation is concerned, remediation guidelines and requirements were identified based on federal and provincial guidelines when land uses are proposed, and a cost estimate was made in terms of remediation. It's very high level, as you can see in the numbers, and they vary quite significantly, but physical remediation is estimated to vary between 175 to 300,000 per 100-meter section of corridor. And then thereafter, a further risk assessment could also increase costs by 95 to 170,000 per 100 meter of a corridor. The cost variation is based on the extent of the contamination findings, and then also the land use remediation target. In other words, whether the target is reverting to industrial land versus, for example, industrial land. Next slide, please. On climate change, the focus was specifically on wildfires, extreme heat and flooding events as far as their impacts along the corridor were concerned. And the opportunities and risks that were identified in this exercise really can be summarized as a corridor can provide a natural buffer that can contain wildfire and flooding. Obviously, a corridor provides emergency routing and also a transportation route to offer supply chain resilience. But a road could also impact the transfer of flood risks, and obviously transit operations could also ignite, cause sparks and ignite fires. That's just a brief summary of the climate change impacts. Next slide, please. So if we move on to land use evaluation and assessment, as far as land use and transportation was concerned, the corridor was split into the 5 segments as shown on that map. Ladysmith, Chemainus, and then moving further south, Duncan being the major urban area, and then to the south, Cobble Hill, Shawnigan Lake, and further south, the Malahat. For each of these segments, land uses were evaluated based on the zoning and official community plans, and a SWOT analysis was undertaken for each of the segment to evaluate development restrictions, the availability of land for development, obviously the densification opportunities in these areas to accommodate increased population. An important part of the land use assessment was undertaking a population protection, specifically based on the recent transit-oriented area legislation, higher densities in catchment areas to identify population densities that can be accommodated. And really that methodology, without going into the details, just focused in looking at station areas, and then looking at populations that were within walking distance of stations, and then in areas further from stations, populations that would use private vehicle to access stations. And population growth projections that were used in this exercise were the projections for 2041. Next slide, please. So briefly, from a land use perspective, the summary of findings really relate to the fact that the corridor segments are distinct, but they also share similarities such as urban cores, but definitely rural residential areas, and then resource and agricultural uses within these segments. The CBRD policy frameworks support creating active transportation networks and using the rail corridor for this network, and policy frameworks also support the use of transit to encourage a mode shift away from the car. In other words, using transit as a catalyst for change. Population projections illustrated there is potential for population growth and therefore land use change. The result of accelerated growth in these areas is the fact that core areas, especially in the urban areas along the corridor, would certainly see significant densification over time as the development of new housing units occurred. Next slide, please. If we go to the transportation assessment, Again, transportation options were based on existing and future land uses, and a high-level analysis was again undertaken from a transportation perspective in terms of their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in these areas. And obviously, as part and parcel of the exercise was to ensure that future use of the corridor needs to be aligned with the goals of the South Island Transportation Strategy, and that refers to improving a connected and integrated transportation network and addressing travel demand, promoting alternative modes, and obviously discouraging the use of private vehicles. In essence, 3 basic strategies were examined for use of the corridor, and those relate to providing a trail only, providing a rail only, and then looking at the opportunities of providing rail and trail together. Next slide, please. As we mentioned earlier on, the development of a propensity model was a very important component of this exercise due to their overwhelming interest in transportation and specifically rail transportation. And in essence, the transit propensity model was just a model to assess to which extent population growth in the CBRD could support a future passenger rail service. So estimating ridership to examine the viability of rail service. In this regard, 3 population scenarios were considered for the catchment areas of rail service, and those were just looking at the existing catchment population. A second one looked at existing but projected growth population to 2024, and then the third option looked at growth based on the provincial transit-oriented areas build out. And as I mentioned earlier, station catchment areas incorporate kind of 2 rings of areas. The first ring is the ring closest to the station, which reflects walking distance to stations, and then the larger outside ring reflecting driving distances to facilitate drop-off at stations or parking at stations. Due to the proximity and overlap of existing stations or station locations in the CVRD, stations were consolidated into 6 locations only. And then obviously assumptions had to be made to estimate rail ridership in peak periods and off-peak periods of the day, as well as assumptions were used to calculate service requirements to meet that travel demand, and that was used to calculate the number of trips required and thus the peak vehicle requirement, in other words, the number of trains required to deliver that service. Next slide, please. So just with regards to this little model and its assumptions, it's a couple that need to be just highlighted is firstly that the rail line remains contiguous and is fully developed north and south of the CVRD, so it's not just a CVRD in isolation. That rail trips reflect round trips over the length of the corridor, so that would be south from the CVRD into the Capital Regional District, as well as into the Comox Valley Regional District in the north to the Courtenay Station. That the necessary infrastructure was in place to support access to rail, and that would include transit service integration and the availability of park and ride facilities and mobility hubs, etc., at station locations. And very importantly, that transportation connections overall are sufficient for users to reach final destinations. In other words, not to look at a rail service in isolation, but the connections to other services for riders to be able to finalize and reach their final destinations. So this assessment really is a statement of the potential ridership and can be used as an input in a future business case. And also a detailed transportation analysis would be required to verify all these assumptions that have been made in the model with regards to trip volumes and direction of service and destinations and so on. The outcome of the model suggests that the estimated population growth is sufficient to warrant a viable service, and that service was identified as being providing a peak service of approximately 3 trips an hour. But just bear in mind that it, as I mentioned earlier on, this takes into account not only service and demand within the CVRD, but the corridor as a whole. So the other regional districts that are adjacent to the CVRD as well. Next slide, please. So requirements for adopting a long-term vision of the corridor just need to be identified and just are listed below in terms of preserving a corridor in its entirety and to address the implications where there are locations where the continuity may be impacted. As I mentioned, to update travel characteristics relating to travel demand and trip purpose. Identifying suitable rail technology to accommodate passenger and or freight rail, because the requirements are could be somewhat different. As far as urban development is concerned, to identify and promote land for higher density use. Confirming safety standards and service standards for passenger service versus rail services, because they are certainly different. As I mentioned before, integrating rail service into an overall transportation network. So that would, for example, include connections to bus and ferry services for passengers to complete their trips to reach their end destinations. Obviously, the updating of costs relating to service, transportation service, rail service operations, but also transportation infrastructure as well as rolling stock. And then finally, to establish a regional or provincial body to oversee the planning, implementation, and operation of such a service. Next slide, please. So based on those assessments, we identified transportation options. Next slide, please. And they are listed in the following slide. So really 5 options were identified. As we've alluded to before, a rail-only option which looks at preserving the corridor for the future introduction of rail. A trail-only option which is converting the corridor to a multi-use trail for active modes in the short and or long term. Thirdly, a combination side by side, if you like, of rail and trail. So introducing trail for active modes, but enabling future rail operations in the corridor. And the 5th option being other uses, or no rail or trail, which really refers to the reversion of land, and this considers remediation of bisected reserve lands. A final, not option really, but a final consideration which should be noted and discussed as well is looking at the potential of providing alternative routes for emergency services, which was evident in the Malahat area. So the assessment of these options examined the issues, risks, and the estimated costs. And in the following slides, we will just highlight the high-level findings and the costs. So first of all, next slide, please. So there we go. So first option, rail only. Obviously, a continuous rail corridor is required to provide the service. It should just be noted again that within the CVRD, 4.8 kilometers of the corridor runs in reserve lands. And a high-level analysis of realigning rail corridor around these to bypass the reserves was identified as being challenging due to long diversions, high costs, which could include tunneling, the requirement for new bridges, and challenging urban environments, especially in developed areas such as downtown Duncan. So really, in essence, rail alignments around reserve lands is not really considered feasible at this point. And therefore, without access or agreements with First Nations, a rail corridor or a rail service within the corridor becomes unfeasible. Next slide, please. With regards to rail costs, let's first look at capital. Capital costs are impacted by infrastructure specifications in terms of the rail line itself. Technical details are provided in our report, as well as what is included and excluded, such as rolling stock. Does it include a commuter service versus an inter-service city service, I beg your pardon, as well as some of the cost estimations included the Parksville to Port Alberni section as well. So this graph just shows in blue how the costs from different studies varied. And so if one looks at the cost per kilometer, which is shown in red, one could see it varies all the way from 1.5 to 4.01 as a cost per kilometer in millions. And these are estimated from various studies. And the final column shows the estimate that was made for this study, the CVRD, and it's a high-level estimate for specifically for commuter rail. So we are capital costs is just in the or just below $1 billion for the CVRD. If we move on to the next slide, please, that shows a little bit of information on once a rail line is established, obviously operating cost and is incurred as well. So this graph shows in blue the revenue from fares, and a revenue of $15 per ride is assumed. The red bars show the operating costs for the different levels of service based on population for the three scenarios that were undertaken. And then the yellow shows the shortfall. And that really is the subsidy that's required to cover the difference in the revenue and the cost. And obviously, operating cost depends on service provisions such as the frequencies and the extent of the service and the times of operation and so on. But it does show that beyond the capital cost, there is annual additional cost despite the income through fares to cover the shortfall between operating cost and fare generation. Next slide, please. The next option looked at trail only, and again, the capital cost for this was estimated at $55 million, and this was based on approximately a 25% asphalt surfacing of the corridor. Of the total length, but that also then included in the vertical raising the vertical elevation for 2 bridges, for 16 bridges, railing and decking improvements, and falling rock mitigations in the Malahat area. And again, beyond capital costs, there is a maintenance cost, fortunately a low number, but estimated at 0.3 of $3 million per year. With regards to soil remediation in this option of trail only, no soil remediation is required if the trail is built on the existing rail bed. If, for whichever reason, remediation of the corridor within the CVRD would be required, that cost would vary quite significantly between 76 and 255 million, depending on the low or high estimate of remediation, and then obviously, as we mentioned earlier on, land use designation. Remediation of CVRD reserve lands, however, is pegged at between 9 and 15 million. So that would be the 4.8 kilometers of reserve lands that are impacted within the CVRD area. Next slide, please. Third option looked at rail and trail. The construction cost for this option is higher than trail only because the railway remains officially active and it requires maintenance of tracks and trestles. The provision, as the picture shows, of a safety fence between the rail alignment and the trail, and obviously safety improvements at rail crossings to meet Transport Canada standards. And then it should also be noted when rail service is introduced that crossings would have to be addressed in terms of improving crossings for active modes. And that's roughly at 16 crossings in the area. The trail cost was based in this option was based on the costs incurred in the ENN trail in Victoria Langford, which was 2.1 million per kilometre, which is significantly more than the 0.6 million per kilometre for the trail-only option. The CVRD cost for rail and trail would be in the order of 129 million. So next slide, please. In the interest of time, it's just a summary of the four options that we have spoken about, just showing what they are and then showing when they are implemented, specifically with regards to rail and trail, and then in the case of rail and trail together. But just a summary slide, which is part of, I believe, your handout. Next slide, please. As we mentioned earlier on, emergency access and specifically alternative routing for emergency services, not an option per se, but a consideration for the various segments. As we mentioned, Malahat is often congested and suffers from accidents and closures and delays. There certainly are limited traffic alternatives to the Malahat, and in fact, the MOTI did undertake a study a couple of years ago to consider route alternatives, which are depicted in this diagram, and the alternatives exclude the rail corridor. These alternatives were identified but not pursued any further. So just a note on that. So if, next slide, please. So just a summary of the options assessment, just to bring this all together, is first of all, in the rail options, first we would require an agreement with First Nations to access the rail corridor and their specific reserve lands, 4.8 kilometers in order to provide a continuous corridor. And a rail-only option would obviously preclude potential emergency access to alternatives on the Malahat. Trail-only option obviously precludes rail in the future, and the costs assume that construction won't require soil remediation. In the case of trail-only, if it weren't a continuous route, that could be overcome by diversion onto the adjacent street network. For rail and trail, this is the highest option in terms of trail provision due to the requirement of the trail adjacent to the rail line, preserving the opportunity for future rail when a business case can be made and funding can be secured. And then finally, other uses or land reversion That means, in essence, means a change in the land use and the soil remediation costs for reserve lands in the CVRD. So that really is a summary of what our options assessment provided us. So if we move on in conclusion, bringing this all together, the next steps really for this project as a whole can be summarized in the following 4 points. First of all, to review the interest in the potential of re-establishing the rail service, obviously in the longer term and in collaboration with landowners. Reviewing the feasibility of expanding the trail network to accommodate active modes in the short term. Undertaking a transportation study to look at the provision of alternative routes to Highway 1 for emergency services, particularly in the Malheur section. And finally, engaging in ongoing and additional collaboration to arrive at an overall shared vision that is supported by all. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for your patience with the number of slides.
Great, thank you for the presentations. I have a request to take a 5-minute break for the board before we jump into questions, if that works for everyone. All right, so we'll resume the meeting at...
I've never been above 160, 170. This is the heaviest I've ever been.
As long as I feel good running, then I'm okay.
How are they?
Spicy. Nice.
None of my clothes fit though.
All right, we'll now resume our committee of the whole meeting, and we're at questions for our presenters with regards to the Island Rail Corridor visioning exercise. So I'm going to turn first to Director Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, and I've got to say, I am a great believer.
Sorry, Director Wilson, can you press the button again? I'm having a bit of trouble here. Apologies. There, continue.
There we go. I've got to stop doing that. Okay, thank you very much. I love trains. I think they're brilliant. And I would love to be able to bring something like this back again. I mean, my kids and my grandkids don't believe that growing up I travelled on steam trains, diesel trains and all the rest of it just to get backwards and forwards. But on a local level, I have travelled before it was shut down on this particular one from all the way from Chemainus to Victoria. And it really is the most amazing trip that I've ever taken. It was beautiful, and I would hate to see it disappear. But when I look at the costs, it more than a sharp intake of breath here. But I would like to bring it back again. I do believe it is the future because previous experience in the UK before we came to Canada, a lot of the branch lines were shut down in order to save costs. And yet 10 or 15 years later, they had to bring them back again because of their usefulness. I would love to see this brought back again. So the question is, on terms of costs, how is that going to be financed and what impact would that have, for instance, on the CVRD, on our taxpayers or having to go to short-term borrowing? There has to be an impact. Is there any study on that particular one? Thank you.
So you want to take this one?
Thanks very much for the question. I guess I should pass this to Johan, please.
Thanks. Thank you for the question. Very good question, because that is always, when one goes through these exercises, that final question that has to be resolved. To answer your question, no study has been undertaken as to how this would be funded. And obviously that is an exercise in itself, because I think the important part of this is to say, okay, if one were to implement something like this, who are all the funding partners? Obviously, provincial government, local government, federal government, and the CVRD as well. And I think it's an important question to have an answer to pass on to residents of the CVRD, so that they are aware of what that cost implication would be for them.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, if I could follow up. Yeah, and this is one of the most important ones. It's, don't get me wrong, we need something like this. There's no two ways about it. But I would much rather know, or even have a very rough figure of what it's going to cost me before any more studies have been going on. The reason here is that the studies have been going on, how long, 5, 10 years or something like that, and we're still no further forward. Let's get some numbers if we can, please. Thank you.
Next, I have Director McGonigal.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for a very wholesome presentation. I think we all accept the value of the Island Corridor, not only within our regional district, but up and down the corridor line. I look historically at the branch line to the West Cowichan area and the way it was utilized industrially, and how it has transformed into a transportation, an alternative transportation hub currently, which has engaged in tourism opportunities, economic opportunities in the West Cowichan area. So I do see the value in rail to trail, but also looking back historically at the adjacent lands, for instance, that were accommodated within the propriety of providing rail service, how quickly that Island Corridor would be reinitiated should those lands be reinstated into other options. That's just a comment. For a question, not perhaps to you, but perhaps to our staff, you mentioned subsidies within your report per ridership. I believe it was a $6 negative subsidy. It would be interesting to see the comparative between what is currently subsidized in ridership in transit as to opposed to those projections, just so that we had an idea of how that could be implicated within budget discussions. We know that any service that we do provide, whether it be recreation, whether it be transportation, transit, are slightly subsidized by taxation. So it would be interesting to know the comparatives in that. Thank you very much.
So Lee, would you like to respond to that? Okay.
Pardon me, did you ask me?
I think the question was more to staff.
Yes.
Yeah, and Director McGonigal's indicated he can also follow up offline. It's noted. Okay, I'll move on to the next speaker, Director Morrison.
Thank you, Chair. So I want to thank Stantec and Modus, a very thorough report. Got to be noted, on time and on budget, so that's pretty exciting. And I'm just thrilled that our staff and our consultants were able to actually do the work quite successfully within the original time frame that the province wanted the work done. And so we're actually done, leaders of the pack and the other organizations that must be doing that work. Well, I think Alberni Clayoquot is very close to completion as well, so good on them as well. I have to say I'm an eternal optimist when it comes to what a huge asset this is. And I just think of, in regards to what Director Wilson had just said, wasn't it just this week that the federal government announced that they're going to do high-speed rail from Quebec City to Toronto? And they don't have, the lands and they don't have the assembly of what's required. They have some of it. Huge multi-billion-dollar project for that area. Yes, they've got the population, different scenario. But, you know, I think what we're facing with the Island Corridor in this area is almost as complex as CVRD budgeting. It's a really, there's so many variables in this. But being that eternal optimist, you know, the question was asked, how much is this going to cost? And we had somebody stand up during public input and say, when I hear the word expensive in a report, I want to challenge it. And I too think of that, what is the cost to not do some of these things that are suggested in the report, whether it's reestablishment of rail or rail and trail and the likes. And why I'm an optimist is that, you know, you just look back as to what happened with SkyTrain. When that was announced, people were selling their properties near potential SkyTrain stations for, you know, pennies on the dollars. And the developers came along and bought them up. Now there's high rises all the way around, all around the SkyTrain stations. And there's been huge economic and social improvement in those areas as a result of a transportation and logistics improvement. And I see that potential for the Island Corridor, whether it's aiding in food security. You know, we grow stuff in this region. We should be able to consolidate, process, and ship it off to other areas. And if we're looking at the future and high cost of transportation, rail's got to be part of that equation, at least from where I sit. I know that our friends in Alberni-Clayoquot are feeling really fortunate that they've got that rail line there and that they can look to the future for deep sea port activities and the tourism potential that with their train that they have there. So I'll stop there and say that, you know, whether we go to residential development along the corridor or light industrial, there's huge potential in a consolidated and maintained corridor. And I hope that we can move in that direction at some point. But I think this report is a great foundation, leaves us some more questions to ask. But I want to thank the consultants and our staff for doing such a fine job. Thank you.
I next have Director Duncan.
Thank you, yeah, and thank you for the report. In the past, I was a City of Duncan representative to the ICF and consultations. And one of the things I noticed in the report was rail crossings, and that sort of twigged on it to my memory in the past, that there was approximately 200 rail crossings, and the cost to upgrade each one was about $200,000. I didn't see any sort of numbers around that in this report. So can you confirm how many rail crossings there are and who's actually responsible to pay for the upgrade of those? Is it each municipality?
Johan, maybe I can help answer this question as a rail
Yes,
engineer.
please.
Yes. So a lot of these rail crossings are existing. I don't have the actual count on my head. Of course, we have listed that in our first presentation and also rail report. And those costs were already covered in the WSP report in 2020. And as a part of the upgrade costs, which were separated out into 3 different phases, initial phase, intermediate, and ultimate phase, all of these costs were accommodated. Of course, the cost that WSP prepared in 2020 was 5 years old. Of course, we tried to scale them up and come up with more accurate estimate. But a lot of those crossings, if we just explore them on Google Earth, they already have active warning system, which means flashing lights, bells, and some of them, they have gates as well. Like a lot of them are already fully equipped. But when I was talking to ICF, some of them were not fully in service due to protecting the asset. So there's going to be some cost for having them activated. And as you guys are fully aware, Transport Canada guideline and Transport Canada regulations are in effect since 2014, and there's a lot of existing agreement between Railway Authority and the municipality on the cost sharing on maintenance fees. So a lot of them are existing. They need to be assessed, and there's a full report, I believe, completed by Bonds on crossing assessment and cost available as well, but the costs have to be scaled back. I hope that answered the question.
follow-up? Director Duncan? No? All right. Okay, I'll move on now to Director Nicholson. Press one more time. Okay, go for it.
Thank you. Thank you for the report. Yeah, like I've been waiting to be able to commute to Victoria for my whole career, 40 years. And then at least for the last 20, the corridor has not been used for anything. And so I try and walk along it, but I fall into holes and it's fairly dangerous. So I'm thinking about timelines here. And I recognize when I read this report that really this is a lot to do with First Nations, so we don't have so we will be waiting for a while that whole situation gets sorted out one way or the other. And so I guess what I'm wondering, in several places the report states that lifting the rail and putting a trail on the rail bed would preclude the return of rail in the future. So I thought perhaps an option might have been that you do a trail beside the trail beside the rail where you could, and then use the rail when you can't do that. For example, through Bright Angel Park, you couldn't possibly have a trail beside the rail there, as an interim thing, which led me to think about, well, what kind of a time frame are we talking about? And I found the report a little bit unclear on that front. So you talk about short to medium, and I'm wondering what short to medium means. Is that 10 to 50 years, or like another two working generations, or how much is that?
Salee?
Thanks very much for the question. Truly appreciate it. I should pass this to Johan, please.
It's difficult to actually determine exactly what is short, medium, and long term in the sense of this report. The long term, as far as this report is concerned, is some point in the future when a rail line potentially can be reinstituted. So short-term and medium-term can be derivatives of that, in terms of perhaps being short-term within the next roughly 10 to 15 years maybe, and the medium-term beyond that. I think at this point that's probably the closest we can get to defining those time periods.
Thanks, Johan. I can also add on top of that, as an engineer, that to have a good estimate, we have to have a design. And of course, on the design, we usually have the first phase, which is conceptual feasibility study. We're going to have at least horizontal alignment, and we can have, let's say, Class D cost estimate. And then we can definitely spend more time to a detailed design and come up with accurate timeline and cost estimate. So in order to have a very robust, not even highly robust, just a very kind of reliable time horizon, a conceptual design drawing across the corridor is required. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Follow-up?
Thank you. Well, I guess, I mean, from my perspective, the question is really about, are we prepared to wait another 50 years for potentially rail to happen? Or could we make the corridor a little bit more useful than it is right now? Yeah.
All right, I'll now move on to Director McClinton.
Thank you, Chair. A few comments before my question. If I had a magic wand, I'd probably like to see rail put in. I think it offers the most options for the most amount of people. Somebody that drove from Victoria to Comox for work in my early 30s, I think there'd be a big benefit there. But as I was listening to the report, I just was struck by, first, just visually seeing our colonial history of, I forget the number, maybe 3 or 4 Indian reserves where we cut through the land. And just a quick personal anecdote. My son, his grandmother is Ojibwe, and his grandfather is the hereditary chief of the Kwakwala band, Alert Bay. And the Ojibwe Nation has tremendous treaty rights, and the Kwakwala, they're in stage 4, and the juxtaposition just couldn't be more bigger. And you know, so when he had the option, when he took his status, he went with Ojibwe. And you know, we see, I think it was said, the full report, there's 2 reserves that they want their land back. And so, I mean, we're pontificating about what we want to do with this corridor. I mean, perhaps there's a section from Victoria to Shawnigan or something along those lines, but I mean, the recommendation that we proceed, I mean, I guess this gets to my question. I mean, without the province sitting at the table, either coming up with compensation or rerouting, you know, unless they weren't 100% clear that they want their land back, I mean, how can we possibly proceed with anything? I mean, I had a hard time listening after I heard that there's sort of 2 nations, or 2 reserves for sure, and then I wasn't quite sure where we landed with the Stamanis and the Ladysmith, where they just got the land transfer for the harbor. So anyways, my question is, what is your understanding of those 2 parcels of land, or 3, I forget, whatever it is, that cut through the Indian reserves? And then how can we possibly move forward?
Lindsay, do you want to take this one?
Thank you for the question. So Cowichan Tribes has bisected reserve lands in 2 areas, and Cowichan, you're right, has been clear that they would like those reserve lands returned, and that they do not want to have a transportation use in the future in that area. We looked at whether or not there could be rerouting. Can you go below, over, around? I mean, transportation routes can be rerouted. Again, it comes back to cost. Halalt is the other nation that has bisected reserve lands and would like the land returned. They were not as decided when it comes to the potential future use. They were interested in options. And in the same way that a rail would impact their reserve by going through it for safety and other reasons, they have the highway passing through it and causing other issues of its own as a result of the truck traffic. So they're interested in understanding potential transportation options. In terms of Cowichan Tribes, we only know what they've shared with us, and I can't really comment on whether or not they might change their position at some point in the future, but that's what we understand today.
Hook me up. Thanks, Chair. You know, yeah, it's a challenging situation. So first I just want to say, and this is with all due respect to Director Nicholson, but you've been waiting 40 years for rail. I mean, these folks on the Indian Reserve have been waiting, generations, right? And I mean, until I hear that they're open to communication or that we have a tangible way to reroute this rail, I mean, or there's some way that is going to accommodate this, I'm very uncomfortable moving forward with these sorts of conversations. I think it undermines their treaties. No, it doesn't undermine. I think it's disrespectful. And I think that that needs to be resolved first and foremost before we have a conversation about crossings, trail, whatever it might be. So anyways, that's a comment, not a question.
Director Mackay.
Thank you. So I think I'm most closely sort of jumping off the point that Director Nicholson was making. And without coming right out and saying I don't necessarily support rail, I'm going to ask a question. Because I don't know if I support it or not. But in the meantime, as we're waiting to sort out funding, as we're waiting to sort out the reserve land question, as we're waiting to find out if north and south of us wish to get on board and make it contiguous, as we've already learned, it's not any use to us if it's not contiguous through as far as it can go and make it useful. It's lots of it is about Victoria. As we're waiting for all of that, maybe 50 years, there must be chunks of rail in existence with sufficient distance that don't involve any critical infrastructure, that don't involve any expensive repair, that we could certainly investigate throwing down some good gravel and creating a cap on it for it to be used as active transportation in the meantime. I'm not talking about a 30-meter chunk of it. I'm talking about substantial lengths of trail that could be used over the next 50 years. We don't even have to pull them up. We could just cap it and use it in the meantime as the rest of this stuff is being sorted out. I feel like we are doing ourselves a disservice, and I don't buy the fact that we can't use it for trail as we wait. Can we make better use of this? Active transportation is a critical part of the work we're trying to do in our communities. Let's address that in the next 50 years as we're waiting for rail. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn to our CAO to weigh in.
There you go. Takes a second. Thank you. I just wanted to go back to the previous comments about the land reversion process, and just remind the committee that this board has supported in a resolution to support the land reversion process, as did the ICF board. And so we also received direction recently from this board to write a letter to the provincial government, which we're working on at the moment, to continue to support the ICF to facilitate the knitting together of the shared visioning work, because arguably we've just looked at the boundaries of this regional district and been communicating with the nations within this regional district. But the corridor is a contiguous piece of land that needs coordination amongst regional districts on the island, and that advocacy letter is going to request resources to support that continued work. We just have a role to play in it, but it needs to be facilitated. So I just wanted to remind that there's a lot more conversation to come, and there's a lot more work as well in it, and it won't be a quick project. It will go on for a very long time. Yeah.
Director Kallio.
Don't touch it.
Thank you, Chair. I just to say it's a great report, and when I was reading this at home on my computer, I actually quite enjoyed it. And traveling in Europe and even some parts of the United States, using the rail systems down there, I mean, we could take a good page out of their book. I mean, traveling around Europe is just so easy to, and England, even in England, they have a great rail system there, and it just takes so many people off of the road. There's just so many people over there and so many off the road, and we're not at the point where we're very heavily populated on the island right now. It's mostly empty territory, but for me, I'm in agreement with Director McClinton, is that this seems like a non-starter, because we need to figure out what we're going to do with the First Nations that have cut this rail line into chunks. And I agree with Director McClinton also in that we have to have respect for the First Nations and the fact that this land was taken from them. But so for me, I think what we need to do is figure out what's the next step forward to make this a continuous line. Otherwise, I just don't see how it can possibly go forward as a trail line, it makes sense to me. You know, I'm in complete support of having the island corridor go forward, but looking at the intersections that have been created in the line, it seems that that's something that needs to be solved as soon as possible. And my question is, what is the potential to negotiate with the tribes and nations involved to maybe get an agreement with them to actually put this line together? Turn this off now.
Follow-up? Somebody say follow-up? Oh, okay. Director Morrison.
Thank you, Chair. I'm wanting to sort of paint a little bit of context here in that this report is what's been prepared and presented on the basis of what the province came to us and said, take this money and go out and create that shared vision. And our staff and our consultants have done that, and I think it's a pretty exhaustive report. For directors that have the concern about the First Nations land, I share that concern, and if you're not aware, all across this country, our federal government has had policy in the past of dividing reserves, whether it be with trail or with rail lines or roads. It's there's actually a really good book written on it. So we are dealing with issues that were, created decades ago. This report, though, and our CAO has reiterated the fact that not only does this board support reversion, which is land back, the Island Corridor Foundation supports that as well. So this is a document that is saying, okay, for our region, we're at this point, this is what we've got, and we're waiting for the other organizations that have been funded as well to come up with that vision for their region. And I have to say that the nations are engaged in this to the extent they can and the capacity they have to participate and do it, because they were also funded and asked the same question as well. I think that the big point, the big takeaway from this, and it hasn't been mentioned a lot, we talk about going back to the province for their direction and funding. But at the end of the day, it's going to be the federal government that is going to be the big decision maker in this. What they will be doing with First Nations and their reserve lands, and what they will be doing around funding major transportation projects like this may be, similar to the one that they spoke about in Quebec City to Toronto. So that's where the main emphasis should lie, is what will the federal government ultimately be doing? And right now, they're not even at the table. So I think I was going to move the recommended resolution, because I think that sort of puts a bow on the work that we've been asked to do. And I think it's been completed in a very satisfactory way. So I would move that recommendation.
So it's moved. Is there a seconder? Seconded. And just to be clear to the committee, so the wording is that we accept the report. So by accepting the report doesn't mean you necessarily agree with all the findings, but it's we need this motion passed as part of the process in terms of this grant from the provincial government. And we have a March 31st deadline that we're working towards. Okay, so it's moved second. It's on the floor. Next, I've got Director Estache. Then I'd like to jump in myself.
Thank you, Chair. Just really quick, as the person who's a little bit obsessed with bikes, I first want to acknowledge, definitely appreciate Director McClinton's point, and that's why I think with the important thoughts he was sharing, why it's really important to reflect on Director Mackay's points of we have important things we have to wait on and work on, but we just keep kicking the ball down the field without meaningfully trying to score a goal on the low-hanging fruit that is keep going hard on short-term usage of the rail, but primarily keep on the great work we're doing with rail to trail. And in the report, I didn't like that it competes the two against each other. Like, we can do both where it's necessary. I think of my route when I do all my CVRD commutes by bike, how transformative it would be when I get to Bonsall Creek to be able to hop on the ENN, it would bring me directly to this building. Yet I have to do a maze of tricky maneuvers, and there's little old Trans-Canada Highway crossings that I have to do. It would be pretty amazing. And then the reason I reflect on that is while we don't have the population density where we have it, we should be focusing on the rails with trails and paving them and doing them properly. Because typically I ride 3 to 4 times in the Victoria area specifically because of their rail system. Just as an example, one converted railway trestle yesterday had nearly 3,000 people cross it in one day on their system. And being that when you build that system, in, of course, density, population, but Victoria in 2022, their stats were that 43% of the population daily chooses not to drive. It's all active transportation. But back to my point of rail, not making it against each other. I mean, goodness, it's a chore. In the summer months, 1 to 2 times, 3 times a month, I ride all the way from Chemainus to Victoria on my bike. Man, it would be amazing when I'm exhausted there to put my bike on a train and come back on it. So train as transit all in, as much as we can do, as Director Kelly said, trains are amazing as such that transit, but then also what Director McGonigal said is interesting, like what is the level of subsidy that we're putting into it as a per user on a tax rate, and what is the ROI on that subsidy if that's invested into adding 4 more buses a day on the Victoria Express, on building the rail to trails where the low-hanging fruit possibilities are that Director McKay said. So lots of good discussion there. I just wanted to share just a quick little bit of input as someone who rides a bike every day when I can. And I only don't do it right now this time of year. Weather isn't an issue, but there's no shoulders, no safe ways from Chemainus to here in the winter, in the dark, where there's no shoulders. And if we had a safe route, I think even more people would be doing it. We're going to see later in the issues there showing where the success of Rails to Trails is in Ladysmith to Chemainus. It's transformed the relationship between those communities and been a really good part to seeing, we've got a really good successful business in Saltaire that benefits from that as well. So it connects those communities, and you'll see in the upcoming report, if you break down the Rails to Trail stats on the counter on the Rail to Trail there, that's 1,466 people a day in Chemainus to the Chemainus to Ladysmith route, 1,466. Grain of salt, that might be out and backs. So even at that, you're seeing 700 plus users per day using the Rail to Trail there. So it's just saying, I don't like the idea of their competing uses, but really wanted to be open to what can we do right now? And of course, that was reflected in both North Cowichan's Master Transportation Plan and also reflected in the CVRD's recent Active Transportation Survey and Report plan that was finalized. Thanks for the time to share those thoughts.
All right, I've got a question, some comments, and I'm going to turn to Director McClinton, and perhaps we can then call the question. Just want to build on the comments from Director Mackay about some of the lower cost options in terms of laying gravel beside the existing rail tracks for walking and cycling paths. I'm wondering if the presenters and perhaps even the CEO of the Island Corridor Foundation might be able to speak to any recent examples of that you could elaborate on in terms of, again, lower cost options to further active transportation. So Mr. Bevan's coming up, then perhaps, Slee, you could speak to this after as well.
Thank you, Board and Chair. It's great to be here again, and echoing hats off to the consultant and staff team. Really incredible work that just shows the complexity that we're dealing with, and we need to continue stepping forward, walking hand in hand with the nations to find really strong solutions that we all benefit from and feel that we can put our heart and soul into. With respect to short-term items, couldn't agree more, and we're having some real great progress in other areas on this where it makes sense. Qualicum Beach in particular has been a leader where through some ditching work and grade all work that we had to do anyways this year, Qualicum town put in another $10,000 and we were able to do almost a kilometer of, I wouldn't quite call it a AAA multi-use facility, but it's definitely you're not stuck in the brambles anymore. And if you have a half-decent mountain bike, and not everyone does, but something with some pretty good tires, you can now traverse on the corridor instead of going on Fern Road, and that's tremendous. We're also going to be launching something on Earth Day in Nanaimo, where there's a real pinch point to get to school in Chinatown in the south end there, and the city of Nanaimo is going to be contributing to get a rough path to connect that school, which is already traversed very heavily every morning by kids, and we're trying to push that back in a more safe way. And yeah, low-hanging fruit. It's not as good as the ENN Trail in Victoria. We would love to see that everywhere, but that's going to be big dollars, and whether or not that can happen in the medium term or not has so many factors at play with the nations, with the other memberships, and maybe not. But I'd say for short-term items, let's put some love into the corridor.
Great, thanks, Mr. Bevan. And I'll turn to Soleil. Anything to add to that? Or Johan?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I would like to add to that. I think, well, first of all, the work that has been done certainly did not go to that granular level of detail in terms of what are the different levels of trail that one could establish. But I do think there is merit in saying that work should be done and could be done to say, figure out, okay, because what we are hearing loud and clear is what are our options looking at establishing in the short term, perhaps not the whole corridor, but portions of the corridor and converting that to a trail. So maybe it's not as Mr. Bevan suggested, it's not the AAA version, but it is a version that really turns the corridor around into some use. So yeah, I would strongly suggest some work could certainly be done in that area. Soleil, I don't know if you would like to add to that.
Thank you very much, Johan. You covered it quite well. Well, just putting my transportation engineering hat here and spitballing, we had different topography and different grades and different, kind of areas across 71 kilometers in CVRD or the whole corridor, roughly 240 kilometers. So we have to do a zoning. There's a need for a conceptual design, and really comes to the cost and different options. Different scenarios can be designed, the widths or typical section of the gravel path, what areas have safety concerns, because we're talking about a rail corridor. And when we have a rail corridor or sharing an area on the rail corridor, there's a lot of safety concerns. And of course, covering or just building a path right beside the corridor. So there's a lot of feasibility and conceptual study required to come up with the first priorities in terms of safety, topography, widths, and also the grades that we can put there so that people can use like e-bikes or just can walk there and do hiking there. So I would say and a study is required to identify the first, areas that could be easily and quickly expanded, then what's going to be the challenging crossing areas, rails and rivers and road crossings that need safety improvements, handrails and bridge rehabilitation, maintenance, and then kind of next phases can be developed. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, just have a couple comments, and I'm going to turn over to Director McClinton, and hoping we can perhaps call the question after that. So in my view, this report has been very thorough and reflects the complexity and the history of the corridor. As you know, a significant portion of the Sea Verde's population lies near the corridor, and as Stantec has shown, we can expect a lot more growth in areas within a short distance of the corridor between now and 2041. This spine is absolutely critical to the Sea Verde's future and should be reflective as such in future growth planning. The public clearly wants to see transportation options provided on the corridor, whether for rail, trail, or a combination of the two. The Sea Verde has been an auto-dependent area for more than 50 years, and with all the growth happening, this has to shift. The answer is not one more lane. The Sea Verde needs to listen to the public and provide leadership so that the corridor can serve as a transportation asset now and into the future. In my view, the Sea Verde also needs to continue to work creatively and collaboratively so that the corridor can benefit the First Nations and public together. We know that Cowichan tribes are becoming leaders in development with impressive projects like the 200-unit River's Edge rental apartments by the Quetzal Development Corporation. This could be a model for how we want to densify service lands beside the corridor and protect and conserve lands away from it. So I'll now turn it to Director McClinton, perhaps to close.
One more lane wouldn't be so bad. Thank you, Chair. No, I just want to go on record. I didn't say this at the beginning. I do want to thank Ms. Miles Wilson and the other CAOs and the chiefs and all the representatives that were really, in my opinion, put in an untenable situation. I like the province was. Hopefully they all agree. That's sort of what it seemed like to me. But it is great to see this report, and I just want to go on record. I'm very happy to receive this report. I think it's terrific information. It's super important to know where we're at and the challenges we have to move forward. It's just clear, in my mind, it's clear to me the first things first is reroute, compensate, or, figuring another solution to deal with the intersection. So with that, I'm happy to. Well, it's already been moved, so we'll call the question.
All right, we'll call the question then. All in favor of accepting the report? And opposed? None opposed, motion carries. We can now move on to R3, report from the Parks and Trails Division regarding the 2024 year-end Park Ranger report. Are we getting an overview from staff, or are we going straight to? Just for information, all right. Any questions from the committee? No? All right. Yeah, Director Nicholson.
Thank you. I read this report with great interest, and it would be very helpful next time if you could please put information about specific parks in there.
All right, seeing nodding from staff. Can I move on to item R4, report from the parks? Oh, sorry. Director Morrison, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. And I was hoping we might actually have staff up here for some questions around this because I'm really curious about the interactions and conflicts that I've heard of recently developed. When we first started the various trails and improved them, it was mainly recreation. We had people using it for equestrian purposes, and then we had the advent of electrified scooters and the like. And one of the issues was motorized vehicles on the trail. I'm now getting reports on a regular basis of the equestrian users, which have every right to be using it, are having pleasant interactions with the ATVers and difficulties with the e-bikes. And the e-bikes can go pretty fast on there, and horses are big animals. So have we been noticing an uptick in the conflicts between the different user groups? Because what I'm hearing is that what everyone was afraid of with the ATVs hasn't materialized, but the new conflicts with other user groups has. So have you got any comment on that?
Through the chair, thank you for the question. When I started, ironically, it was the motorized vehicles that were the problem, which kind of initiated the Share the Trail campaign, which has now been kind of going for 2.5, almost 3 years in various stages. And then I was just talking about this today. Anecdotally, what I've noticed is the motorized vehicle issue has gone down. I was inundated with those calls when I first started, and that is no longer the case. I think it's a combination of, the ATVers being a little bit wiser to it. Maybe they're conducting their their activity after hours when there's less people on the trail, or they've just realized the game is up and they've moved on, or other park users have read our signs and they've kind of felt empowered to be able to go out and tell people themselves because they can see the rules stated pretty clearly. So then in a vacuum then comes the e-bikes. That is something that comes across my desk for sure. People complaining about the speed with which cyclists are going on the trail. And that's also just cyclists, that's not just e-bikes. So that's, the Sunday riders who are really going. I get a lot of calls about that up in Saltaire and Chemainus. So it's not necessarily just an e-bike problem. I think what's happened is the motorized vehicle issue has subsided slightly, and then the proliferation of e-bikes has come in to kind of fill a little bit of a vacuum.
Thank you for that. And just a follow-up, this was initiated by some folks that were that have been regular equestrian users and like to get out on their horses and ride on the weekend, but they now feel that that our trail system isn't appropriate for their use because of the potential danger of their animals being surprised, and so are we doing anything to ensure that that those users that are entitled to the use of our trails are feeling welcome and able to enjoy the benefits of them?
Yeah, through the chair, thanks for the follow-up question. We are, one of the things that I've been focusing on, and particularly in the spring and summer, is what I call checkpoints. So I'm actually stopping at various locations around the CVT and checking in with people, both their experiences, the pros and cons of their use. So we do kind of do reach out campaigns with trail users just to kind of engage with them, as well as to kind of stop people who are in the middle of conducting themselves contrary to the park bylaw. It's important to note though that with e-bikes, there's a limit to to how fast that they can go. And that limit is recognized and categorized by ICBC and the powers that be that conduct our road rules. And the e-bikes that are allowed on our trails cannot go faster than 32. It's just slightly over 32 kilometers an hour. So a lot of the complaints that we get are, to be honest, people's experience. Having a negative experience, the e-bike is going past them at a clip that's a lot faster than the horse that they're on. But when you actually lean into the situation, the e-bike isn't going any faster than what's allowable. And we are, conscious that, when you're sitting still or just walking along, some people are pushing strollers, some people are walking with their kids. Any cyclist going past at the max speed is going to be startling.
Follow-up, Director Morrison? No? All right, any further questions for staff? Director Nicholson? Oh, can you press it one more time?
I was so well trained before. Chemainus River Park, I was wondering how often you get out there and what the issues are these days.
Well, thank you for the question through the chair. I do get out there. It's pretty quiet these days. It used to be a lot worse from everything that I've read. There's no longer the bullet hole damage and the gates being ripped and that sort of thing. But we do have people camping, as we have all over the region. I was there this past Sunday and someone was operating a sauna, that they pull behind their truck. So there's little things like that. But anecdotally, from my perspective, I have yet to encounter problems of the severe nature that were happening there before. But all that said, I still hear stories of, summertime parties and campouts and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of park damage, damage to trees, tree theft, like I said, unauthorized hunting and fishing, I'm not seeing that as much as we were before I started. Yeah.
Any further questions? All right, thank you. So this was just for information. We can now move on to the next report from the Parks and Trails Division. This is with regards to the 2024 CVRD Parks and Trails Visitation Program Summary. Any questions for staff? Director Eustache.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question on, as I spoke really quick on the Chemainus to Ladysmith Saltaire Rail to Trail. I was just curious, was the trail counter relocated? And I don't know if we publicly, it's a policy to share where they are. I'm just curious if it was a change because now there's multiple access points now, or was it because of the change of the new parking lot, which is, of course, getting tremendous usage. And at that 63,000 for last year being down, I'm just curious if that isn't indicative, as we heard there are some concerns of usage. They aren't really conflicts, that their education misses. Some people have never seen horses, some seniors have never ridden bikes, but my question is, on that 1,466 on average people per day, where is that count being initiated?
Who wants to take this one?
Thank you for the question through the chair. The location of that counter has stayed the same. And where we've located it is in our central location on, I believe it's Davis Road, or not Davis Road, sorry, Douglas. So right where there's a kiosk and a bathroom, a portable, yeah. So it's there because it's right in the middle and it hasn't changed locations.
Okay, as a follow-up, Chair, is there any thought on temporarily, possibly this summer at peak times, getting a count on the south side of the road at the new parking lot at North Watts there, just to get an idea of usage initiating out of the investment that CVRD made into that parking lot?
Yeah, we've talked about the idea of around new builds and, if it's a newly created corridor or kind of a new attraction, so to speak, is putting in trail counters for temporary periods, as you said, particularly during the peak times, just to get a snapshot and then we can report out from there. North Watts is under consideration, Shawnigan Rail Trail, and the like, so yes.
Great. Yeah, and thank you to all the staff as well. That's my go-to. I either run it or ride it every single day, and the quality of work and cleaning up after storms and everything there, I know I'm going on, but it's an opportunity to thank staff. So definitely staff have done a great job there, and look forward to the continued success of it.
Director Wilson.
Don't touch it. Yeah, thank you, Chair. A technical question more than anything. With the counters, how do you compensate for somebody going in and then somebody coming out again? Does that count as two, or is there any compensation on that kind of thing?
Through the chair. Thank you. Yes, we kind of look at every single counter and kind of deliberate how it's being used through that. So if it's like into a park, you can assume that they're going in and out. So we'll divide that by two.
Okay.
So we do some division of those numbers depending on like how we think that might operate.
That's what I figured.
Some of the ones along the trail, we might assume that some are doing a through and some might be doing it back. So we might divide it by like 1.5, for instance.
Okay.
So we do try to account that as we
Good.
define those numbers.
Thank you very much.
Director Morrison.
Thank you, Chair. I think I might have asked this question last year and got some interesting answers, and it's more in regards to asset management of the counters. I noticed in some figures that there may have been, in my area, a counter that had either malfunctioned or had been damaged, and that we've had some of these counters for quite a quite a length of time now, and are we, so my question is really about, are we having counters aging out? Are we having any recurring software, hardware issues? What's the state of the inventory of the equipment? And are we going to be looking at, I think we could probably do, as was indicated earlier, some spot and point in time counts, but I think there's other parks that may deserve to be monitored as well. So how are we doing as far as our inventory and replacement of old equipment and the likes? And are there any specific issues around damage or vandalism that we should know about?
Through the chair. Yes, this is a question we kind of deliberate every single year. This year in particular, we found a few have been aging out, so we're kind of reviewing purchasing of some new ones to replace those. In the interim, we've had some that we can put in the interim that should suffice for at least a few years, we hope. But this is kind of like an ongoing issue that we address on an ongoing basis. We do have incidences, particularly at particular locations, of vandalism, which kind of deter our numbers being useful in some instances. So those are some locations we also deliberate of relocation or different positioning of those, just to help with those issues as well. But yeah, we're kind of reviewing some purchasing of some new counters to compensate some of those aging ones.
Yeah, just as a real quick follow-up, I think I'd be interested if staff could come forward. I don't know if it would be what are we calling them? They're not supplemental items anymore, but they're additions to service. Service enhancements, because, investing in our parks is really important, and it helps me as a director to know that if I'm getting increased usage or heavy usage in one area or another, to have that data is really helpful on where we direct our assets. So if there was the ability to acquire more equipment, monitor more parks and more areas, that would be something I'd be interested in. I don't know if my colleagues would be, but it would be for my area at least. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We'll now move on to the next report here, also from the Parks and Trails Division. So this is with regards to the 2024 Park Reservations, Special Events, and Parks and Trails Volunteer Program Summary. Any questions for staff? All right, so this one, sorry, I keep looking at all your faces. I got to look at the screen, so I'll get the hang of it. Director Wilson, then Director Morrison.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I've got a question here. I'm a great believer in volunteers because I think we really do underutilize the resources and the expertise that there is out there and the willingness of groups to help us out. They do a very good job if they're allowed to do. And half the problem is, and I've got an email here from a local Ramblers Association, which is voicing their serious disappointment and concern that Parks has opted to they're using the word ignore, our offer of doing the preliminary work of plotting out the hill as it currently stands. These are very experienced hikers. They use the trails all the time. They've offered to map the trails and everything else, and yet they're not being used. They're going to be using, I understand, consultants to do it. Why are we not taking more advantage of the volunteers that we've got in instances like this to keep our costs down and to engage the community when they want to be engaged? Thank you.
Through the chair to director here, I believe it probably has to do with the type of work. Through the volunteer policy that we have in place, there's only certain types of work that can be done that wouldn't interfere with sort of unionized staff and those type of things. And it could be a capacity issue as well. I think it just depends. Does anyone else want to jump into that, or does that answer the question?
Does that answer your question, Director Wilson?
Not really.
Did you want to jump in?
No, it doesn't really, because I've heard this before where it's a question of liability, it's a question of training, and it's a question of this. There's always, and I'm going to be as direct as I can here. More often than not at this table, I hear what we can't do. Whereas what we can do, what we can achieve with the kind of resources we've got available to people who want to help. As far as liability is concerned, I checked this with the Municipal Insurance Bureau, and they said as long as they have been given some kind of training, they are covered under our insurance. So the liability question really is a non-starter. So let me ask the question again. Why are we not taking more advantage of willing groups who have the resources and the expertise to carry out this kind of work without paying other people?
Through the chair, a very good question, and at the end of the day, it really comes down to a few things that was mentioned by Elizabeth around capacity, around our ability to respond to groups' interests, how it aligns with the work program and plans that are established by the board every year with budget approvals. So we know there's lots of groups out there with lots of great ideas. At the end of the day, it really comes back to this table in terms of where you see overall the Parks and Trails program, both in electoral areas and regional parks, establishing priorities. We have a lot of outreach with volunteers, as you see in the report before you. Quite a lot of projects were done both through the volunteer program last year, but also a significant amount of staff time through the program is also supporting groups and organizations that are holding events in your parks across the region. So it comes down to capacity. So certainly we'd be happy to delve into this more with the committee if there's a desire to see what more can be done, how we can reach out and engage more with our community volunteer interests. But at the end of the day, it comes back to how we as an organization can support them to be able to do things in your parks.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. And I'll follow up with a comment here as far as capacity is concerned. It seems to me there's an awful lot of rigidity. There's no flexibility here at all. And that's something I'd like to see. Thank you.
Director Morrison.
Thank you, Chair. Through the staff, and I may need some help in remembering if I got the details here exactly right, but it seemed that a couple of years ago we had found that some other jurisdictions were changing their policy as to what was allowed to happen in parks, and I think it was somewhere in Greater Vancouver where they were allowing people to bring a bottle of wine into the park and have a bottle of wine on the beach. And we really hadn't developed a policy as to what actual activities would be allowed in our parks. And so it seemed to me a couple of years ago we were talking about developing a special events and use policy as to what would be allowed and what wouldn't, as in like if people wanted to have their wedding reception in a park, and would alcohol be allowed to be in there? Would there be able to be food preparation and the likes? Have we engaged in that study or review yet?
Through the chair, Director Morrison, you have a wonderful crystal ball because staff are currently working on that, and we're looking forward to bringing it forward at a near future meeting.
Director Nicholson.
Thank you. Director Martman has helped me by covering my butt. I'd like to just bring us back to this. Okay. Asset management. I don't think we have an inventory, maps or inventory of our ecosystems that we have in our parks. Do we?
Chair, through to Director Nicholson, for all parks, no, other than what exists at certain mapping levels across the region, and or what's been done specifically when we're doing a park management plan.
Right. So to follow up with Director Wilson's comment about volunteers, and I think there's a real opportunity to maybe engage the schools, VIU, on programs to have an inventory done by students, because I think that's the first step of you really need to know what you've got in your parks, and if you're going to, especially if you're going to do a management plan, it's nice to know what you have and potentially the condition of it. And so I think that's a real opportunity that we should look into. Thank you.
Director Estache.
Thank you, Chair. Super quick before my question, just thanks and acknowledgement to staff for all the events last year, and also hats off to the huge turnout of CVRD staff at the one event, specifically the Cowichan Autumn Classic trail running event. So thanks to the CVRD staff that make events like that possible. There were a lot of really soaked but huge smiling faces on our fellow CVRD employees and myself that participated in that event. So thank you. And then also as the lead course marshal for the Burnt Bridge Classic, I was a motorized lead, so it was good to see that what staff did to let users in the area know that a race was on. Of course, that's working with the organizers, but that's a significant event that takes significant CVRD resources. So I didn't run into any user conflicts or anything, especially people not expecting to see a marshal on a motorbike. So that from that standpoint, that how you make these events possible is great. My question, though, is we're seeing it at North Cowichan and then now also here at the CVRD board. Is it at a point where we might need to revisit the how we look at large events and more open to them? The reason I speak to that, of course, now for the third year, the Belgian Waffle Ride's coming back. This is because of the work that Lake Cowichan's done and the Trailblazers. They're going to have a new race there, the Coastal Trail Running Series. That's going to be the first of its kind out there this year. And then North Cowichan, on behalf of the organizers that do run the Burnt Bridge Classic, are currently trying to bring the Canadian Gravel Bike Nationals to the Cowichan Valley for this year, bringing it from Calgary, which is a multi-million-dollar event. So, of course, those using CVRD assets, do we need to look at our policies a bit different as we're getting bigger and larger events that utilize parks and trails? Of course, bringing huge economic impact, but also are taking more staff resources to make them a possibility.
Chair, a wonderful question, and certainly that will be covered off under that policy that's currently being developed to be brought forward in the near future. Because certainly staff are recognizing as well that the popularity of parks and trails across the region, not just for our local residents, but visitors coming to the region, but also the ability to host events and activities is growing, and in some cases growing quite substantially. And how do we manage all of that to maintain that balance between the general recreational use, the ecological integrity of our parks and trail sites, but also recognize that these larger events also bring some prosperity to the region and have a lot of spillout effect for other businesses and activities that take place here as well. So, end of the day, it's a lot of positives, but we need to find ways to approach it on a balanced basis. So, good question, and yes, that'll be part of the work that's being done right now.
Director McClinton.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, staff. It's great. I certainly support Wine in the Park and other similar activities. And also, I'd like to support Director Wilson and his ideas around volunteers. And perhaps down the road, there could be a notice of motion for hiring a volunteer coordinator if there's capacity issues within the parks. I know we've got a lot of people that love our communities and they want to get out there and help, and it is happening. But if I think in many especially the electoral areas, I think there could be we could better utilize our volunteers.
Director Wilson, a close.
Yeah, do we not already have a volunteer coordinator? That's what I thought. Yeah. No, that's what I thought. We've already got one.
I'll just reply to that. So my position is Parks Volunteer Coordinator. However, it is a split position, so that's why both of these parts of the report come from me. And you can see the attachment to do with reservations and special events is quite large, and that's again a capacity issue. Because there's just the one person dealing with all of the event applications and picnic shelter reservations and field trips, et cetera, as well as the volunteer program. So there's a lot of potential for growth, but capacity issues sort of hold us back a little bit.
Chair, if you'll let me follow up.
Yeah,
Hang on.
Oh.
I'm not finished.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, Director Wilson, then Director McClinton.
That was just an aside.
I didn't know that it had gone to you. Sorry.
No, that was just an aside because you were more concentrated on your bottle of wine. Is there anything that we can do apart from, now, you're part-time, is that correct?
The position's full-time, but the volunteer coordination is only like half of what I do say.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. So is there anything that we can do to increase the use of volunteers? I'm going to keep on about this one, so that make it a real priority, so that we can reduce the maintenance and asset management costs, because they are huge. We've seen in the upcoming budget just how huge those costs are. There has to be something we can make a priority in order to use the expertise, the willingness to bring those costs down.
Ms. Miles Wilson?
I do see that Brian's giving me the eye, so that he may have a response to this, but I just wanted to remind as well that we are going to be taking a look at the strategic plan coming up, and that would be a good opportunity for directors to voice kind of perspectives and kind of interest to look at service levels in the organization. So that we're in the works in the planning stages of that session. So I just wanted to make that note. That would be a good opportunity.
Great, thanks. Director McClinton, want the last word?
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to slowly remove my foot from my mouth. I do apologize. As I was saying volunteer coordinator, Director Acton was writing it down and I was having trouble reading it. Just to the point, it is more capacity, I think is great. I think I know you're coordinating with some of the folks in Saltaire and the trails that are, so I do know that there's work being done with the volunteers. It's just, I'm just in support of sort of the idea that Director Wilson had. So forgive me for not knowing their correct titles. Thank you, Chair.
All right, so that concludes our reports. We can now move on to question period. So this is an opportunity for the public, a chance to ask a question regarding the business of the CBRD. So we allow up to 15 minutes, and it's comprised of two parts. The first reserved for questions directly to agenda items, and if there is time remaining, questions may be on a matter of public interest related to the CBRD jurisdiction. Each questioner is permitted to ask one question plus one follow-up question related to the answer. The question must truly be a question and not a statement of opinion or speech, and questioners must avoid personal references, insinuations, violent, offensive, or disrespectful remarks about another person, and unparliamentary language.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kim Bernard, Area B, Shawillican and Shawnigan Lake. I will have two did you know questions to inject a little bit of levity and a little bit of follow-up. First of all, did you know you have tremendous community volunteer assets right here in this room? And following this meeting virtually, I've been in close contact with Mr. Cliff Evans throughout the meeting today. And we both represent the NICE, N-I-C-E, that's on my shirt today, which is Neighborly in Collaborative Enthusiasm. We are also, that in Hokamina means Natsamat Shkwalawan, that we want to go forward in a good way together, the public in volunteering, and he and staff as well. And so I have huge thanks for park staff on a number of levels. We do our annual cleanup in the parks. We do all kinds of things, field work. Mr. Cliff Evans has been teaching me how to gather data in a very scientific way and to take the pulse of our ecological assets. And I just think, that we, my question is, did you know? and also my second question is, did you know that the EcoPlan report as it was presented today, both electronically and in a printed copy I just received, actually cuts off in the last attachment on page 52. And so I'm wondering, could that please get fixed for the EASC?
Yeah, so for the first question, now we know, so thank you. And I think we can easily address the problem with the report when it's presented at the EASC.
And the last question is, did you know that when I went to use the QR code for the newest survey, the Community Satisfaction Survey, the very first gatekeeping question is, do you have a member of your household that works for CVRD Parks? And once again, I want to thank the CVRD Park staff for mentoring my son as a gatekeeper this last 3 years, but unfortunately, it means that I can't participate in the survey. Did you know?
Now we do, thank you.
Thank you for all your hard work. Let's get to lunch.
Thanks. Any other members of the public with a question for the committee? All right, so we can now move on to the closed session, and just in the interest of time, staff have suggested we can refer items CSR 1 and CSR 2 to the closed board meeting later this afternoon. Moved? Is there a seconder? Seconded? All in favor? And opposed? Unopposed, motion carries. That concludes our business. Can I get a motion to adjourn? Moved? Seconded? All in favor? And opposed? This meeting is adjourned.